Hello everyone, and thank you for being here. We are Group 1 and we will be presenting on Egypt. Just a quick introduction or summary to start here. The things we'll be covering is immigration, refugees and war, macroeconomic policies, unemployment and inflation, income and wealth distribution, poverty and social unrest, economic growth, public and private sectors, and then lastly, global and regional integration, and then exports and imports. So we'll be starting things off talking about immigration. Currently, Egypt has the largest population out of all Arab countries. They have 97 million people, with the next second being Algeria with 42 million. So they are very much ahead of the pack in terms of population. There are currently 9.5 million expats living in Egypt as well. Millions of Egyptians live in other countries as well, such as the United States, England, Australia, South Africa. So they very much have a give and take of people who are leaving the country and those who are entering the country to work as well. COVID-19 has had a large impact on Egyptian immigration. The borders actually closed in March and were closed for multiple months. They just happened to open back up in July. So they were only a few months down, but with how big immigration is, that was definitely a large toll on Egyptian immigration. As we move on to the next slide here, we are looking at refugees. So currently 250,000 registered Syrian refugees are currently staying in Egypt. There's also thousands of other asylum seekers staying in Egypt as well. This is actually a smaller number of Syrian refugees that is actually documented, because there are obviously multiple thousands, tens of thousands of Syrian refugees who have came in undocumented. This kind of not really hurts the economy, but a little bit, considering Egypt, being the host country, is unable to know exactly how many they have in their country and how many they're taking care of as a country. Egypt does not have refugee camps, unlike neighboring countries around them. Most refugees live in urban areas. In addition to Syrian refugees, multiple other countries have a large refugee population as well. Two of these including Sudan and Eritrea. Eritrea is actually has a lot of refugees as well, because of the strict way the government has been ruling the past few decades. Those who are attempting to seek asylum in Egypt have the possibility of being accepted or denied, with those who are being accepted being provided living assistance. With that acceptance or denying system, that's kind of why we see so many undocumented refugees, because refugees, they need to get out of their country, so they will be, whether they are accepted or not, sometimes they will come in regardless. Moving on to talk about war in Egypt and how their military has been through the past decades. They're currently not involved in any conflicts. They do still consistently train with allied countries such as the United States and others, and spend billions of dollars each year still in military funds. The United States also provides heavy military aid in order to help keep Egypt's military up to date and ready to fight if anything were to happen. And actually, as I was doing some research, going through and looking online, a lot of scholars were writing about how Egypt is militarily a slumbering giant compared to other Middle Eastern countries. They just have so much foreign aid coming in, and the amount of money that they spend each year on military. If they were actually to go to war with another country, I think that we would see an unexpected amount of force coming out of Egypt. And switching slides here, just still on war, taking a look at a few graphs. On the right, we can see this rectangular graph here is U.S. assistance and what they've how they've assisted Egypt economically and militarily. And we can see that on the right side of this graph, military, that they have been assisting less in aid throughout the past decade, but I believe that the number that it's still at currently is much more than other allies that we've given aid to, and we are a large portion of the aid that is given to Egypt in total. So then, just looking here, I just threw this on here because it was kind of interesting on the left here. This is a graph about Egyptian concerns, what Egyptians are most concerned about in their country. A small portion in terrorism on the left, and then on the right jumped up to 47%. And then the economy almost split, not 50-50, but as you can see, 39-33, and then political stability hovering around the 30 to 40% range as well. This concludes my section on immigration, refugees, and war in Egypt, and now I would like to pass it over to Lubin to talk about macroeconomics, unemployment rates, and inflation rates in Egypt.
Hi, I'm Lubin. I'm going to cover macroeconomic policy, unemployment rate, and inflation rate. Firstly, Egypt occupies the northeast corner of the African continent. Egypt is bisected by the highly fertile Nile Valley, where most economic activity takes place. Despite Egypt's mixed record for attracting foreign investment over the past 2 decades, poor living conditions and limited job opportunities have contributed to public discontent. According to the CIA World Factbook, these socio-economic pressures were a major factor leading to the January 21st revolution that ousted Mubarak. Economic growth in Egypt estimated at 5.6% for 2019 and is forecast to strengthen to 5 to 8% in 2020 and 6% in 2021, supported by board-based economic reform programs since 2016. Other factors supporting growth include the recalibration of government's social inclusion programs away from general subsidies on energy products to targeted transfers and improvements in the business environment. Tourism, construction, and oil and gas were driving growth. On the demand side, consumption remained subdued as exports and investment were more robust. So, for the macroeconomic policies of Egypt, the first period is from 2004 and 2010. Economic reforms. Egypt made a slow transition from a relatively closed to an open economy starting in 1991 within the content of an IMF stabilization and structural adjustment program. The underlying goal of the reform program was to remove binding constraints to growth by restructuring the public and financial sectors, streamlining business regulations, enhancing trade liberalization, and privatizing state-owned enterprises and joint venture banks. Essentially, the Egyptian government signed onto the so-called Washington Consensus, a term coined by John Williamson of the Peterson Institute for International Economics to describe a set of economic reforms that countries should undertake if they wish to stabilize their economies and generate sustained economic growth. Okay, so the second period is economic development since the revolution. Under the SCAF-led government, Prime Minister Sharaf, in power from March 3rd, 2011 to November 12, 2011, he drew up a plan to increase taxes and reduce subsidies, indicating that austerity measures were necessary. But there was no follow-through as his government was replaced, and the successive government of Carmel postponed any major economic measures until after the upcoming elections. So the last one is the new economic strategy. It is estimated that Egypt will require some $22 billion in financing for fiscal year from 2012 to 2013. In the absence of a clear economic program, it is also projected the economy may only grow as much as 1.5 to 2% in 2012, and thus it will require a renewed emphasis on economic reforms to raise the growth rate to levels sufficient to absorb the large and growing labor force. So I'm going to talk about the unemployment rate of the Egypt. As you can see the data, so for the whole trend overview, the unemployment rate keeps decreasing over the year from 2015 to 2019. Unemployment refers to the share of the labor force that is without work but available for the seeking employment. Egypt's unemployment rate fell to 7.2% in the fourth quarter of 2020, compared to 5% in the same period a year ago and 7.3% in the previous quarter. It was the lowest jobless rate since comparable data began in 2003. Amid the continual return of normal daily activities after the end of the closure decision and partial curfew taken by the state to limit the spread of coronavirus, the number of unemployed persons decreased by 163,000 to 2.166 million people. The jobless rate went down in both urban area and the rural areas. So here we can see there is a Egypt unemployment rate table. The table shows the unemployment rate data from 1999 into 2020 last year. So we can see the unemployment is really not steady over the 2 decades, but since about 2013, the unemployment rate keeps decreasing steadily, and 2020 years unemployment is the lowest. So next I'm going to talk about inflation rate. Inflation as measured by the Consumer Price Index reflects the annual percentage change in the cost to the average consumer of acquiring a basket of goods and services that might be fixed or changed at specified intervals. As we can see the data here, the inflation rate actually increased almost every year until 2017 to 2018. The consumer prices fell about 0.42% from the previous month in January, a sharper drop than December's 0.41% decline. January's result marked the sharpest fall in prices since June 2019. The result was primarily driven by plunging prices for food and beverages. In addition, price pressures for transportation also decreased at a faster pace. Inflation eased to 4.3% in January from December's 5.5%. January's reading represented the weakest inflation rate since September 2020. Accordingly, the trend pointed down mildly, with annual average inflation coming in at 4.8% in January. Core inflation fell to 3.3% 6% from the previous month's 3.8%. The graph here shows the inflation rate about 3 decades, which also include the predicted inflation rate. For about over 30 years, the inflation rate of Egypt is really unstable, as we can see, but for recent years of Egypt, there is a clear sharp decrease from year 2017 to 2019.
Hi, my name is Perry Forbes, and I will be covering income and wealth distribution in Egypt, poverty in the region, and how the two have created social unrest. First, it's important to remember that Egypt is a resource-poor, labor-abundant state. Therefore, oppression from the upper middle class on the poor plays a pivotal role in socioeconomic issues and income. Also, as a resource-poor, labor-abundant country, income distribution and poverty rates are high because there's a lack of good jobs. This is primarily due to the excess demand for said jobs from youth entering the workforce. First, regarding income inequality in Egypt, the state scores relatively low, but there are reductions in welfare. Initially, between 2000 and 2005, income from transfers, wages, and agriculture increased, but in 2009, non-agricultural income has decreased sharply. Declining income in these sectors thus led to declines in standards of living, food, and clothing. The graph on this slide shows the large income gap between the top 10% in Egypt and the state's bottom 50%. According to the World Inequality Database, the top 10%'s income is about 30% larger, and it has increased from 44.6% in 2010 to 47.3% in 2018. The bottom 50% of Egypt's population experienced a 1% reduction of income from 2010 to 2018. This wide income gap also highlights income inequality in the region. The Gini index rates the state of 38% due to the distribution of wages between social classes. On the next slide, I will further discuss how income inequality has led to poverty. Egypt's economy has been able to recover since the 2011 revolution and the fall of Mubarak. But while their growth rates have been able to exceed 5% in the region, poverty rates increased from 27.5% in 2015 to 32.5% in 2018. There is a steady rise of income poverty rates, and as of 2018, 32 million people live below the national income poverty line. Poverty mostly affects Egyptians living in rural areas, but those living in urban sectors have also been affected drastically. The table on this slide highlights the different poverty rates among Egyptians living in differing regions. Poverty rates are generally higher in Egypt's rural areas in all years. Between 2015 and 2018, poverty in urban areas increases significantly, while a small increase of poverty was experienced by residents in rural areas. Rural Upper Egypt accounts for only 25% of the population. However, it is home for 40% of the whole poor population in Egypt, which makes it a priority region for Government of Egypt assistance programs. Also, the Egyptian government implemented many structural adjustments to sustain growth in the private sectors, which led to unemployment decreasing by 7.5% in the 2019 fiscal year. But these adjustments led to an increase in prices, which in return masked any increases to income from 2015 to 2018. Because of the increased poverty rates in Egypt, a majority of the workers are wage workers, and more than half are without social insurance. Many of these wage workers are without formal employment contracts, and 32% seek employment outside the establishment. In short, many youths and workers are migrating out of the country to seek better opportunities. To address these issues, the Egyptian government has further established social safety nets, such as a subsidy program that focuses on establishing food and housing security. Widening income gaps and lack of sustainable income between the top wealthy and middle class/poor has led to the protests in Egypt. On the next slide, I will be addressing how the public has reacted to decreases in income and increasing poverty. Interestingly enough, Egypt rarely experiences public protests that reveal dissatisfaction with the government because President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi banned any public gatherings of more than 10 people without government approval in 2013. But in September of 2019, many citizens in Cairo and several other cities began to protest against Sisi, accusing him of corruption and mishandling government funds. Many of those who took part in the protests are charged with being affiliated with the outlawed group, the Muslim Brotherhood, and were accused of spreading false news and protesting without government permission. To combat the protests, state-backed digital and media was used to discredit the allegations of the protesters. Much of the unrest stems from the IMF structural adjustments Sisi implemented after oil prices crashed in 2015. But the reforms put in place called for the government to remove currency controls, gradually remove food and energy subsidies, increase tax revenues, and put an end to already limited state hiring. But because these reforms caused much of Egypt's population to fall below the national poverty line, nationals began to protest. Today, in the wake of COVID-19, protests have erupted again because citizens continue to experience deterioration to socioeconomic programs. Lastly, I want to discuss how COVID has impacted income and public unrest. Egypt is close to becoming a fragile state and closer to social unrest more than ever as COVID-19 poses higher risks to the nation's health institutions. Low wages have also impacted physicians, causing 10,000 to migrate out of the country between 2016 and 2019. Additionally, because public hospitals in Egypt are understaffed, Egyptians have indicated that they deemed the state as illegitimate in taking care of citizens. And as of 2018 and 2019, 31% of Egyptians stated they were satisfied with the performance of the government's healthcare service. The state is also vulnerable in the wake of COVID because lack of traveling has caused revenue from tourism to significantly decrease. Coupled with new policies that limit economic activity, around 60% of impoverished Egyptians are expected to take the most damage. Thus concludes my section on Egypt's income and wealth distribution, poverty, and social unrest.
Hi everyone, my name is Bean and I will be covering Egypt's economic growth in relation to their public and private sector of the economy. Previously, before the effects of COVID-19 crippling the global economy, Egypt had a period of economic stability within their region. Economic data that surfaced during the pandemic showed Egypt's period of economic stability taking a sharp dive. Now, further economic losses are expected if the pandemic persists. In this graph, we have economic challenges faced by Egypt in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. We can take a closer look here on how Egypt is managing its economy to step back onto the global stage again. Foreign investment/aid from the International Monetary Fund has approved a $2.77 billion aid package for Egypt to help the economy bounce back up. The Egyptian public sector relies heavily on its military, even though their military has a poor track record of providing long-term growth needed for a stable economy. The reasoning behind this could be pointed towards as a way of reducing the country's overall defense budget by shifting the military's costs over to a different part of the economy. Now, this odd form of military economy therefore pays its senior officer less, but giving them more opportunities to acquire extra income through the country's public sector, hence the public's distrust to their own public sector. The public sector does show gradual improvements, though, through the hiring of more educated workers and more diversity among males and females hirees. In this graph, we can see how the public sector of the Egyptian economy is improving by showing how increasingly diverse their hirees are through education and sex. Private sectors in Egypt are on an uneven playing ground. The elephant in the room is the word nepotism. Former state-owned enterprises, which are now private, have the privilege and luxury of connections with high government officials. High youth unemployment rate is indirectly caused by the lack of connections. The usage of connections to obtain jobs are widespread in Egypt. Lack of competition and diversity within the private sector is one of the many causes contributing to the slow growth of the Egyptian economy. The private sector, though, do show signs of improvement lately through government interventions. In this graph, if we take a moment, we can clearly see how the private sector of Egypt really struggles, whether that be through the barriers of entry, logistics, or human skills/resources. We can see how tough it is to be part of the private sector in Egypt.
Hi, my name's Taylor, and I'm going to be talking about Egypt's exports and imports. As a quick overview of Egypt's exports and imports, I want to first start with their trade deficit. The trade deficit is when they are importing more than they are exporting out of the country. Currently, Egypt imports about $8.3 billion in US dollars versus them exporting about 3.52 billion in US dollars of goods and services. Egypt's top export is actually gold. About 12% of all their exports that they make to foreign countries are actually represented by gold. This adds a value of $2.65 billion in US dollars yearly to the Egyptian economy. As for Egypt's imports, their largest import is mineral and chemical products. That's about 25% of all of their imports are represented by chemical products, which is a quarter of all of their imports. Since mineral and chemical products are not produced enough in Egypt, the demand for these goods is typically high. As an importer or exporter, this is a great opportunity to consider, as mineral and chemical compounds also sell for good prices and they aren't easy to transport from one location to another. So if we go to the next slide, I'm actually going to talk a little bit more in depth about Egypt's exports. There isn't necessarily an Egyptian export that dominates the field. However, as we can see in this graph, gold accounts for 12% of their exports, meaning that gold is the good that they export the most of. Following that is crude petroleum, and then following that is refined petroleum. I found it interesting that the site that I was using actually split them up, because prior to this I really hadn't thought of petroleum being different as crude versus refined. However, it explained that crude petroleum requires certain local investments. However, refined petroleum requires more funds invested in it than crude petroleum. Even after that, though, the income from exporting this type of petroleum can reach $802 million, which means that the initial investment is rapidly recovered during that export process. The highest export was nitrogenous fertilizers. These type of fertilizers reach an export value of $767 million. And as you can see on the graph, they represent around 3.4% of all the Egyptian exports. They're also called around the world in different ways according to the type and concentration they have, such as ammonium, nitrate, sulfate, calcium, all that different kind of stuff. Egypt's fifth largest import is insulated wire. It may not be the most popular export when it comes to Egypt, but it's an important one when regarding their whole economy. It actually represents on average about 3.3% of all exports made by Egypt, and it brings in about $741 million to the Egyptian economy. All other exports, goods and products made in Egypt, they contribute, better to local economies. Cheese, for instance, is exported in the value of $284 million and equals about 1.4% of all their exports, which is something that I thought was kind of interesting because I hadn't thought about Egypt and cheese. Another example of this is furniture pieces. They have a value of about $352 million and represent about 1.6% of their exports. There's a multitude of small exports that individually might not mean much by themselves, but they do make a difference for the national economy of Egypt. As we can see in the graph in that other category, the green section, about 70% of their exports are actually other. There isn't a major export that defines Egypt. However, this varies slightly for their imports, which we will see on the next slide. Their highest import is the mineral and chemicals that I talked about on that first slide, which makes up 25% of all imports represented is by chemical products. That's a quarter of all of Egypt's imports and is their largest category in imports. Their second largest import is agricultural products, which represents about, as you can see on the graph, 24% of Egyptian imports. The most popular agricultural products that they bring in is wheat, maize, and meat. Meat is something that is highly consumed in Egypt, and the price for it tends to remain high compared to other foods because of its high demand. Their third largest import is electrical equipment. When it comes to Egypt's electrical equipment, it's high in demand, especially in urban areas of the country. The fourth largest is base metals, reach almost 13% of imports each year. Base metals actually tend to be important in a variety of industries, which is why they can be very popular in Egypt because of their developing industry. One I didn't include on this graph but thought was kind of good to mention is that they import a lot of wood, paper-making products, textiles, and footwear. It actually represents about 10% of the imports that they bring in, which, even though it's not the top 3, I think it's still kind of good to consider that they're bringing in a lot of their clothes and their footwear, paper-making products. For instance, paper imports in Egypt actually reached the value of 1.16 billion US dollars in 2017 alone. I think that just kind of goes to show what a large market of goods they are actually bringing into their country. If we go to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about not just the goods that they're exporting and importing, but who they're exporting and importing with as well. Their highest export value destination was actually the United States at 8.82%. If you look at the graph in the bottom left-hand corner, I know it's kind of small, so I do apologize for that, but it shows the heat map of where they are distributing their exports to. The green means they're exporting a lot of products, so as we see with Italy, they have a large green dot over them, so they're exporting a lot of product there. We also see that they're exporting a lot of products to Europe with that yellow region, the cluster of small yellow dots, and some exports with the red dots, so not as many, to Canada and Mexico. Their highest import destination was from China at about 14.7%, so that wasn't really surprising to me, especially with what their imports typically are. I also found it interesting to note that their highest export of 2020, at the time of the data that I viewed, it was gold as their highest export. I did contribute this possibly to the coronavirus pandemic and them having issues with oil demand not being quite so high, which I'll go into a little bit more in a later slide. But as for the next slide, I'll be talking about agricultural versus industrialization. So Egypt actually started out as a large producer of cotton, which is interesting since now their exports are mostly goods like petroleum, crude oil, and gold. The other interesting part of that is one of their large imports was part of the textile industry, which I just thought was interesting that cotton used to be one of their major productions, and now they have to import the finished good in. Looking a little farther into the specifics of their wheat and corn imports, as we can see, their total consumption of wheat and corn far exceeds their production, and actually their production of wheat is far below how much they're actually importing. In the next slide, I can talk a little bit about how COVID has impacted some of their exports and imports, specifically with oil price adjustment. Throughout COVID, there has been this phenomenon that oil isn't being as used as it much was. There's far less air travel, far less travel in general, so that was a large hit to the Egyptian economy. For instance, Business Wire actually talks about how contract awards for the first half of the year were less than a third of the total for 2019, although only just below the 6-month total for the same period as last year. Therefore, there had to be a considerable increase in contract awards in the third and fourth quarters if Egypt is to match last year's total at all. So I think that kind of shows how much the coronavirus has really impacted one of their major exports, and could also go to explain why their gold export was so high throughout 2020. On to the next slide. Just to wrap it up, thank you guys for listening to our presentation, and does anyone have any questions?